Yes, just get it out right away. I'm going to be saying the words diarrhea and vomit during this presentation, and you are all eating, so I apologize, but someone put me at lunch, so it is what it is. Again, my name is Alida, and I'm going to be talking about an outbreak associated with ice cream. My coworker over at Department of Health helped me put together this presentation and came up with the funny title, but I am with the Department of Agriculture, just to clarify. So we worked together very closely on this presentation. Again, just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a graduate of the University of Minnesota 2 times over. I apparently love the U of M. And in 2009, I graduated with a degree in nutrition and dietetics, and then as already mentioned, 2014 with my master's degree in public health. And Team Diarrhea is a group of students, master's students at the University of Minnesota who work with the Department of Health on interviewing people who have had foodborne illnesses, so we get to ask all sorts of fun questions about how many times they've had diarrhea in a day and if there was blood in their stool, and people get really excited to tell us about all of the gross things that are happening to them, because when you're sick, I don't know, sometimes you just want to tell somebody about it, and sometimes your friends don't want to hear about it, so that's what we're there for. But we do more than that. We try to identify the actual cause of the outbreak through those interviews and developing kind of a hypothesis there. Presently, I coordinate the Rapid Response Team for Minnesota. And the Rapid Response Team, for those who are not familiar, which is probably many of you, is this national program where there are representatives from a variety of different states. So I represent Minnesota, and we're a national response network that is funded by the FDA. So entirely federally funded, started in 2008. And what we do is coordinate kind of big events, so like a big foodborne illness outbreak across the United States, or a contamination event like maybe the romaine lettuce outbreak from the spring you might have heard about. We worked on that. Natural disasters, a lot of the rapid response teams down south do a lot of work with hurricanes and how that affects the food supply. But just events where there are many moving parts, many programs involved. For example, we worked on Super Bowl 52, making sure that there was no contamination at any of the facilities, especially the teams. Lots of people threatened to poison the teams with food, and so we kind of follow up with those complaints and things like that. Just anything that stretches beyond routine, and this is an example of one of those investigations that stretched beyond routine. So we are at a swine conference, and I am presenting on ice cream. When I first heard about this, I was like, what will that have to do with what I'm going to talk about? You might be wondering that too. And no, it's not just bacon-covered ice cream, though that looks pretty good. So not exactly something that fits in, but it is a really, really good example of an outbreak that shows how small our food world is becoming. Not only can food travel around the world more quickly and easily than ever before, but it can also be stored longer than ever before. And so this means that a contaminated food item or feed item has a really great potential to cause illness. So whether we're talking about a pathogen like virus in ice cream or in pork products or animal feed, we're all facing the same challenge, which is how do we keep our food, our animals, and our people safe? So before I jump into the outbreak, just a quick background on the chain of regulatory responsibility. So when we're looking at the farm, anytime that the animal is alive, that's regulated by the Board of Animal Health. But once we get into the actual processing of a product or animal, then Minnesota Department of Agriculture takes over. And we inspect and regulate anything from the processor, transport of food, down to a retail location where it's, I call it the take and eat rather than the eat on site. So we inspect like grocery stores and bakeries, versus Department of Health, who then will go into a restaurant, and they focus on locations where food is consumed on site, like an ice cream shop. So that's why we worked closely together on this one. You've already seen this slide, but for those of you who don't know, norovirus is a really common pathogen cause of acute gastrointestinal illness, aka vomiting and diarrhea. It's like what a lot of people call the stomach flu. It's actually norovirus. And in Minnesota, norovirus is the etiology for about 60% of all of our outbreaks. And it's usually caused at the source. So it's usually a food worker who is ill and shedding the virus and then contaminates the food. So we see a lot of, for example, wedding norovirus outbreaks where The baker actively has norovirus and is frosting the cake with bare hands, and they were sick. If you think about it, norovirus is a fecal-oral route, so maybe you don't want to think about it, but then suddenly your entire wedding party is coming down with vomiting and diarrhea. So we do see a lot of those sort of what you call point source or kind of an individual event-type norovirus outbreaks. And then as far as reporting illnesses, a lot of the illnesses come through a general foodborne illness hotline. The Minnesota Department of Health has a specific person who answers all of these calls and takes down all of these complaints. But complaints also might come into like city or county health departments, and then those are all filtered up through Department of Health, which is really great because then all complaints throughout the entire state get into one system, and we can look at them all together to identify if there's some sort of a pattern happening. So let's get into it. Here we have our outbreak. It's August 8th, 2016, so it's summertime. We don't see a lot of norovirus in the summer. It happens, but norovirus tends to be more of a fall and winter virus when people are in close quarters, sharing meals, celebrating holidays, being cozy. So it was kind of odd. So we had this first complaint. 2 of 3 meal companions that ate at Restaurant A on August 4th were becoming ill with vomiting and diarrhea. And you'll notice I'm going to say Restaurant A or ice cream manufacturer X. I'm not going to say the actual names of the facilities. You'll probably be able to figure it out if you really want to think about it, but we don't share that information unless it was a publicized outbreak, which this one was not. We looked at the incubation period, so the time between when they ate the product and when they became ill, and it was about 30 hours for both of those people. So as I mentioned with norovirus, we look at just that point source. So we sent an inspector out to Restaurant A to talk to them about norovirus. That's what we were suspecting. Talked to them about cleaning and sanitizing, making sure no one was working while ill, interviewed some of the patrons and interviewed some of the food workers to ensure that there was no illness. So of the 2 cases that had illness in this complaint, they both had vegetarian tacos, and then they both had brand X raspberry chocolate chip ice cream. 5 controls were also interviewed, and they had a variety of other menu items, and they did not eat any ice cream. This is a big restaurant, so there are 85 employees, and 5 of them also said they had vomiting and diarrhea between late July, early August. So we're thinking here, okay, this is probably another typical norovirus outbreak. One of the employees was sick and contaminated the food and got these patrons ill. But then one employee mentioned that we all eat a lot of this brand X ice cream. Like we scoop it out of when we're working, and like after our shift, we all eat this ice cream. It's delicious and we're addicted to it. So we were kind of thinking, oh, that's interesting, but nothing to write home about quite yet. Until August 15th, we get another complaint. And this was at a totally different location. So this was at Brand X Ice Cream's Franklin retail location. So it's an actual little ice cream shop. And we had 20 people that ate there together. I don't know why there were so many people there, but 3 of them said that they became ill with vomiting and diarrhea. And those people all ate raspberry chocolate chip ice cream. And the other people who didn't get sick ate a variety of other flavors. So now we're thinking, okay, this is getting a little bit more interesting. We have 2 different retail locations. So we are working with Restaurant A, and we're working with this Franklin retail ice cream location. Shortly after that, there's another ice cream shop associated with this, and it's on Upton. And so it's the Upton retail location where we got some additional illnesses. So if you're looking at these 3 locations, they're all supplied by a general manufacturing facility for the ice cream. So this is where all the ice cream is made, scooped into containers, and then those containers are sent out to different restaurants, ice cream retail locations, and the like. So we were thinking, that's interesting. That might be a good place for us to go continue our investigation. So meanwhile, August 17th, the Hennepin County Epidemiology Group received a complaint from a country club. And they said, okay, we had a bunch of people that went to a catered birthday party at our country club on August 13th. They all got sick. We don't serve Brand X ice cream, but when we were looking at their illness, it was a little too short. So norovirus, it's usually about 30 hours from eating something until you become ill, and this was a lot shorter than that. So we were thinking, oh, that's maybe not matching up quite right. And so Team Diarrhea did a lot of interviewing of those party attendees and found out that a subgroup also ate together on August 12th, the day before, at a private party. And so then they were like, okay, this is interesting. Let's talk to the caterer of this private party. And sure enough, the caterer had gone to this Franklin retail location and picked up chocolate, vanilla, and raspberry chocolate chip ice cream and brought it for dessert for this private party on August 12th. So here we go. Over in Minnetonka, we have our private party. So the caterer picked up the ice cream and drove it over to have at the private party. Our Department of Health epidemiology group did a small case control study. I mean, we were pretty confident that we knew what we were looking at this point, but it's always good to have some numbers to work with. So comparing vanilla chocolate and raspberry chocolate chip ice cream, the most significant being the raspberry chocolate chip ice cream with a p-value of 0.02, 5 of 5 cases and only 2 of 9 controls having eaten that ice cream prior to illness. And we have our epidemic curve starting with our first cases at Restaurant A on the 4th of August through the 14th of August when we got our last cases. The ones with the black dots are just ones that were confirmed by our laboratory, so they collected a stool specimen from those cases and confirmed that they did indeed have norovirus. So as I mentioned, we were looking at this commissary kitchen, this manufacturing location where all the ice cream is made. And so that is in the wheelhouse of the Department of Agriculture. So I went out with one of our dairy inspectors on August 16th, and we went out to the facility to do kind of a general inspection as they did at the restaurant. And we wanted to know how this ice cream was made and maybe if there were any ill employees at the ice cream manufacturer. So we went through the ice cream ingredients. There was a vanilla base mix that they use, and then they add in chocolate chips, frozen raspberries, and then they mix the frozen raspberries with the sugar stabilizer mix. There was no kill step for the raspberries, so they were not cooked. They were just thrown in frozen into the ice cream. But interestingly, there was no employee contact with ice cream. It was mostly done by machines. The only employee contact really was kind of stirring with this big wooden paddle, and they weren't really interacting a whole lot directly with the ice cream, so there weren't a lot of opportunities for them to contaminate the ice cream themselves. And actually, after interviewing all the employees, which Team Diarrhea did for us because they're great, all 16 were healthy. They didn't report any illness. So I wanted to just point out the frozen raspberries were a unique ingredient. So this was an ingredient that wasn't in any of the other ice creams offered by this manufacturer. So all of the ice creams used that same vanilla base mix. A lot of them had the chocolate chips, and the sugar and stabilizer was used frequently in other flavors, but the raspberries were unique to this specific flavor. So we really were interested in the raspberries. We were like, take us to your deep freezer, and they did, and it was full of raspberries. So they had gotten this giant shipment of frozen raspberries on July 22nd, so that was like 13 days before the first case meal dates. And on their website it states, handfuls of fresh-picked West Coast raspberries swirl up against chocolate and vanilla. And we're like, what West Coast are we working with here? Because when we looked through the boxes of raspberries, they were coming from Chile, Serbia, and China. So maybe the West Coast of South America? I don't know. But we were working with this massive number of different types of raspberries that they were just kind of tossing all together. They weren't doing any sort of tracking of which raspberries were going into which batches. So it was really hard to trace where the raspberries were coming from. And as you'll remember, this outbreak took place in the summer of 2016. But when we were looking at the packages, some of the raspberries in the freezer were packaged and frozen in 2014. So this is a product that has a super long shelf life and had been around for a while. So kind of a traceability nightmare when you look at it and think about where this product was coming from and how it was just being commingled at this tiny ice cream manufacturer in Minnesota, of all places. So we really wanted to figure out what was going on. So here again, the raspberry shipment was received on the 22nd. We really had a bad feeling about this ice cream, so just out of caution, we asked them to withdraw the product. So we asked this ice cream manufacturer to pull all of this raspberry chocolate chip ice cream from all of the places where it had been sent. So it was a sort of recall had taken place. It was more of a product withdrawal. So 146 tubs were returned. And then we went back and did some sampling. So we sampled a bunch of the ice cream that's the back of my Subaru. We piled in 10 2.5-gallon containers of ice cream, all different lot codes. And then we grabbed 2 bags of each of the different frozen raspberries. And the results, not surprisingly, and we did have a couple extra vanilla and chocolate from that caterer. We sent those too. Those were negative, side note. But the raspberry chocolate chip ice cream, this was tested by FDA. So we had to send it on dry ice to Maryland, which was a challenge all in itself. But our lab in Minnesota doesn't have the ability to test for norovirus quite yet. But a lot of those were positive, and so we thought, okay, this ice cream is definitely it. And then looking at the actual frozen raspberries, the ones from Chile were negative, the ones from Serbia were negative, the ones from China were all positive. And I mentioned the 2 bags that we collected. FDA actually went back and collected 3 more bags, so that's why it says 5. So we had 5 total bags of these Chinese raspberries, all positive for norovirus. So, in conclusion, this was an outbreak of norovirus associated with ice cream produced with contaminated frozen raspberries sourced from China. The ice cream manufacturer has initiated a kill step for the frozen raspberries, so now they do heat up the raspberries before they add them to the ice cream to a temperature that will kill norovirus. And in addition to that, FDA, while I don't know the entire background of what took place, there are some restrictions put in place for any raspberries coming from this facility into the United States. So we've seen this more and more kind of over the last 5 years, frozen berries as a vehicle for different viruses. Mostly hepatitis A we've seen. Perhaps you were familiar with the strawberry outbreak, hepatitis A outbreak, norovirus. A lot of these have happened in Europe. But this was the first norovirus outbreak due to imported frozen berries in the United States, to my knowledge, to our knowledge. This outbreak was tough to find, and so it's kind of an assumption that perhaps norovirus outbreaks due to commercially distributed foods are more common than we even realize, just because they are hard to find. Most norovirus outbreak detection systems are venue-focused, so they're not really sensitive to commercially distributed vehicles, particularly retail products. So we're kind of grappling with this question, are frozen berries a high-risk food? And I would venture to say yes. We've seen it a lot in the news where frozen raspberries have been identified as the source of several different outbreaks. And even recently we saw mixed berries, raspberries in Canada, and then a frozen pomegranate outbreak as well. So we are seeing more and more of this issue, and a lot of, for example, Europe has, the EU has been working with testing about 5% of all frozen berries coming in from China to ensure that they're not contaminated. Several different countries have instituted a sort of boil order, so boiling all frozen berries for 1 minute before you use them, especially if you're serving them to a high-risk population like the elderly or children, to ensure that they're safe. So just something that we're maybe starting to see in the United States, or maybe has been going on that we haven't been able to identify as easily, but through this outbreak, fortunately, we were able to pinpoint that. So with that, I just want to thank everybody who was involved in this outbreak, particularly Amy Saup, who, as I mentioned, was part of our Department of Health group, who worked on this with me. But lots of different partners worked on this outbreak. And we went off for ice cream afterwards because we thought it was safe at that point, and it was delicious. So that's Amy and I getting ice cream at the place in question. That shall not be named.